And below all that are the refugees. Now, refugees, these aren't recent refugees. In fact, many of them aren't refugees at all. They're the children of refugees and the grandchildren of refugees, people who lost their homes in 1948. And they live in these quote-unquote camps within the West Bank, but also in other countries. And these are essentially slums. You walk into these areas and you can immediately see how much poorer these people are than the average Palestinian. You go from Nablus city center to Balata camp, which is one of the largest in all of Palestine. And there's, garbage strewn across the streets, incredibly crowded buildings, many people to an apartment, maybe 1 or 2 schools for thousands and thousands of children. And the reason is because as refugees, these people don't have status under any country. The UN is responsible for them. And there's a special agency called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, that's responsible for all services to refugees within Palestine. So you have a resident of Nablus who isn't really a resident of Palestine at all. He's a refugee under the UN. And in fact, if you ask him where he's from, he won't say Nablus. He might say Haifa. He might say Jaffa, which is near Tel Aviv. He'll name the place where his grandfather lived before the 48 Exodus. And these people have really horrible conditions. They have a tough time finding jobs within Palestine, getting university places. And so there's this real stratification. And essentially, anyone at the top of this list does not want to fall one rung down under any circumstances, because what rights they do have will suddenly disappear. And so, basically, Israel exploits this to create division between Palestinians. So, for example, you may have heard in the recent peace process that the Palestinians refuse to recognize the Jewish state. That's one of the sticking points from the Israeli perspective. And the reason for that is if you say Israel, as it's currently constituted under the 48 borders, is a Jewish state, then you're abandoning any fight for the rights of group number 1, which are Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. And that's very hard to do because that also means you're abandoning the right to return to these areas. You're saying that these people, although they're Palestinians, are no longer part of the Palestinian national struggle. And Israel knows this is an immense difficulty for the Palestinian Authority, but it creates that requirement because it knows the PA can't meet it, and then again, they claim there's no partner for peace. And similarly, people in East Jerusalem don't want to become exiled to the West Bank, and so they try not to stir up any trouble. They try not to get in the way of the Israeli occupation forces. They try not to attract attention to themselves, because when you attract attention to yourself, you get arrested, and potentially you could lose your house, you could lose your status, you could lose your job. And so, Jerusalem, this is where I lived. I lived in the Old City, literally. And the pink part is West Jerusalem here. And you can see that, essentially, Israel has created a ring of settlements around Jerusalem. And the idea, again, is to make Jerusalem inseparable from the rest of Israel because of this contiguity of Jewish neighborhoods. And the part you see that's labeled E1 is the part that will stretch out to the Dead Sea, thus dividing Palestine from north to south. And essentially, East Jerusalem is the main focus of house demolitions. You have families who've lived in their homes for generations, simply losing them. And often, the Israeli requirements are extremely arcane. For example, it's quite normal to have to produce an Ottoman deed of land ownership from before 1918, from before the First World War, to prove you really own this land. I mean, how many of us could prove who owned the piece of land we live on almost 100 years ago? Or you have to prove that the British mandate, you paid taxes to them. And even if you can prove these things, there's something called the absentee property law, which means that if they deem that the man who's technically the owner of the house doesn't live there anymore, well, they just take your house. And for example, 4 months ago, there was an incident where 8 families near Herod's Gate in the Old City went out to a wedding. It's 8 families living in a single home is quite normal, because these are quite large houses. They went to a wedding, and when they came back, there were simply Jewish settlers sitting in their kitchen. And that's it. They've gone to the courts, but the courts never have ruled in favor of a Palestinian family in a housing dispute. And eventually some sort of municipal compromise was reached where all the Palestinians had access to 2 rooms of the house that included 1 kitchen and 1 bathroom. And the rest of it is now a settlement. And if you walk by it today, it's still a settlement, and there's a nice big Israeli flag hanging outside the door. And that's really the shape that the settlement enterprise takes in Jerusalem. You have people who have lived in a house for decades, and then suddenly one day they're gone, with no warning, with no order. with no sort of court case beforehand to justify this. It simply declared that this can now be Jewish property, and it is. And so it's a very sort of insidious bureaucratic system that allows these things to happen. Now, obviously, in the Old City, they only evict, they don't demolish, because these are historic homes. But in the rest of the Jerusalem, it's quite common to actually see a demolition, and then that area becomes state land, and then it might become a quote-unquote green zone, and then eventually it almost inevitably turns into a settlement of some sort. And even though you can see between the ring isn't quite complete, along all the areas sort of east of the Old City, there are in fact incipient settlements. Like in Silwan, you may have heard of the City of David, which uses archaeology as a sort of defense of the Jewishness of a particular area. And the Mount of Olives as well now has settlements, even though that's been historically a Christian Arab area. So Jerusalem is essentially under constant assault. And there's a lot of evictions and demolitions that enable the settlers to move in.